All right, welcome, friends. My name is Ian McKenzie, founder of The Mythic Masculine, and I am delighted to be joined in conversation today with Nisha Moodley, an integrative leadership coach, community builder, founder of Global Sisterhood Day. For nearly 20 years, Nisha has been a guiding voice for women leaders, helping them move away from the old hustle of the old paradigm toward a new way of leading that is rooted in soul, devotion, and collective liberation. She's the founder of the Center for Devotional Leadership and the host of the Devotion podcast. Also, we share a number of mutual friends as well. And so it feels like the conversation was sort of inevitable at some point. And so it's a pleasure to speak with you, Nisha.
So good to be with you, Ian. I'm grateful for our time and the trust that comes with having shared beloveds in our
Mm.
lives. So, yeah, grateful.
And so this is an emerging conversation, actually, that we sort of jammed a little bit beforehand. Both of us stirred in ways like many feels like the entire collective field has been stirred deeply by the impact, the release of the Epstein files,
Mhm.
and I feel like we both have been cultivating work. I work largely with men over the last number of years, men and this inquiry into masculinity, sexuality, shadow, all these dimensions which feel like absolutely just alive and triggering the collective. And for you, working with women in terms of stepping out of a paradigm often called patriarchy. And that's for some, again, that can feel very quickly dismissive. People can dismiss that depending on how they understand the word. But there's something around this culture of domination, oppression, that Riane Eisler, of course, has beautifully articulated, and others for a number of years now, trying to point to the thing, trying to point to the thing. And so I feel like both of us are sort of sitting on either side of this endeavor to shift culture, to do deep culture work, and ask questions like, what is the role of men? What is the role of women in this time? And so I feel we wanted to first start with just uh, speaking to what we're tracking, the impact on ourselves, and what we're
Mhm.
seeing with the release of the Epstein files, and kind of go from there and just see where the conversation wants to go. So I feel like that's a bit of a setup for our time together,
Mhm.
Nisha. And I wonder for you, again, who's been tracking a lot of these themes maybe for some time, and now, of course, with the release of the files over this past few weeks or so, how is it landing for you, and what are you tracking?
Mhm. Um, well, the first thing that I'm noticing is that there's a lot of horror, rage, and um, like a fierce, intense passion for changing things that I'm seeing amongst so many of the women that I'm speaking with. I lead a lot of groups, and so I'm often, in the Zoom room with, and actually recently in person also, but with, a dozen women, 20 women, 40 women. And there's a lot of exhaustion, when I ask, how are you really at the beginning? And people give their check-ins. There's a lot of exhaustion. There's a lot of freeze. There's a lot of rage. Um, there's a lot of crashing, like uh, sort of hitting the ground with depletion and exhaustion and rage and fury all at once, you know? And then there's also, the excitement and the joy and the other textures of our human emotions. I'm just noticing that we're in a moment where it feels like we're shrouded by this sort of um, quiet heaviness. Um, and I can't say that most of the women that I'm speaking to, including myself, are particularly shocked. I think there's some shock to the degree to which much of it, I will not say all of it, aligns with what was coming out in QAnon. And, there's also, I just want to say, a lot of like anti-Semitic bullshit woven in there as well that um, I think is a sort of clever, like look over there, not over here, diversion.
Mm,
And also QAnon propped up Donald Trump as the savior, as the one to save the day, which now I'm like, oh, okay, I'm quite sure that was a whole conspiratorial design to create this thing and seed it into our collective consciousness to have us looking in the wrong direction and not in the right direction. But that's a whole other conversation, maybe. What I'm feeling and what a lot of the women I'm around are feeling is not exactly shock. It's horror, and again that fierce passion for change, and also varying degrees of um I don't know if we can quite afford hopelessness, but confusion at how on earth we're gonna do it.
mm, mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for laying out that. I mean, I think it's worth saying too up front that, of course, there's so many layers of complexity in certain ways around the release of the Epstein files, and I know, I've dipped my toes in certain, I would say, more afield in the conspiratorial territory around who exactly Epstein was and what was the purpose and who was he working for. There's it's all that stuff is there, and there's lots to explore and to get lost down. And I think that for the purpose of this
Yeah.
conversation, that I think we're wanting to, I think, explore, shine some light, unpack why was someone like that, in this
Mhm.
case, Epstein, able to entrap or to create situations, largely through, seems the exploitation of young women, especially, where there were
And
takers,
girls,
there were
yeah.
men, yeah, girls, that there were men wanting to do that, like that. What was it that was so enticing? Because again, if that shadow wasn't there in men, and it seems by far largely men, if the shadow wasn't there, then there'd be nothing would have happened, right, in the sense, right? There would have been no takers to that kind of enticement.
Mhm.
And so clearly, there's something that was um, brought forth in this sexual shadow around men, and that's something old, very old, obviously, that's been going on for a long time. And this is a new degree of it. I think that's just been splayed wide open and amplified through the collective field,
Mhm.
largely through, I mean, mainstream media, but also, of course, through the social media. And I think it's worth noting that we live in a time where, social media, I was speaking about this yesterday to my partner, Asha, that it's like we, let's say we're reading about this in the paper, maybe years ago when there was just papers, right? And there's a degree of, you could argue, how pure is the message or journalistic or something, sure, there's perspectives there, but at least there was through the medium, you could read about the story and you would say, like, wow. And you have a kind of titration with the material in a way. I think you could take it in a bit different. You could talk to people around you. You could,
Mhm.
work through in some sense. Whereas now you turn on your phone and, maybe I just want to see photos of my brother and his kids or something. And the whole feed is,
Yeah.
it's all
Yeah.
Epstein. It's all wild allegations. It's all right. And so that kind of triggering the collective nervous system constantly, we're not built for that. We're
Yeah.
not built
And
for
our
that. And this,
bodies don't necessarily experience it as if it's not happening right here in front of us, which
yeah,
is bad for the nervous system. It's also maybe good for the fierce call for change. So from another lens. But anyways,
for
please
sure.
continue. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, this is again where I go back and forth on, well, like, is it helpful? Of course, that it's all coming to light in a sense, and now there's this degree for change, and at the same time, what is the work? There's outrage, as you spoke to. There's grief, but again, these patterns of called the sexual shadow of men have been going on a long time, and I think you were saying to a lot of women, what's being triggered or remembered is that perhaps all those micro and macro moments of experiencing that kind of energy to varying degrees their whole lives. And I think you wrote about this on your Instagram as well.
Mhm.
And so, in a sense, that energy feels not unfamiliar, but it's just again amplified to a degree now, which is it's impossible to ignore on as in a collective level. So that to me feels a bit different in the sense of that Me Too in a similar way was all these women basically saying, hey, Me Too. I've also been subjected to this kind of trespass, this kind of behavior. And all of a sudden it was like, the collective couldn't ignore that this is such a rife experience for so many women. And so it feels again, there's this sort of moment of collective reckoning and then what to do about it, right? How can we meaningfully do about it? And maybe not necessarily at the political level, because I know there's talks too of like, why are they being prosecuted and all that stuff? And maybe so hopefully there will be that kind of thing. But how do we work with it at the level of, our bodies, our communities, between partners, men and women, that level?
Mhm.
That's where I'm curious about, because I think we both operate in that layer.
Yeah, and what I've heard, and you referenced this open letter that I wrote to men recently, and I wrote it to the men who see themselves and relate to themselves largely as good men, like who would morally distinguish themselves from the Epstein class in many ways, right? And so there's obviously like a degree of social and political and financial power that exists over there, but also just like the men who would say that behavior is abhorrent and that's not me. And I'm grateful for all the men in the world who can say unflinchingly that behavior is abhorrent and that is not me or that is not who I want to be. And also, I think it's a little too easy to distance ourselves when these things happen, or when they happen, when they are shed light, when light is shed on them because they're happening. um, when light is shed on these things, it's easy or convenient, maybe, or hopeful to distance ourselves from them. And I think that a degree of that is fair. A degree of saying, actually, the Epstein class, which is a untouchable billionaire, political puppeteer class that seemingly thinks they can get away with whatever they want, that this world is theirs and they own it. That is different from the 99% of the rest of us. But that sexual shadow that you're naming, it's not just Epstein. It is also, I don't know if I'm pronouncing this right, but the Bachabazi, I don't know if you're familiar with this
Mm.
practice in Afghanistan and parts of Afghanistan and Pakistan, where there's intense, like, gender separation.
Separation.
And there's a practice of basically trafficking young boys to be Bachabazi translates to boy play. So trafficking them as sex slaves, performers, they're dressed in traditionally female dress and they perform for these men. And it's not like one man, it's dozens, hundreds of men watching and engaging. And so there's that. And then there's Giselle Pellico, and that whole thing, with her husband drugging and trafficking her out to 50 plus
Oh
men
yeah,
in
yeah.
their community. So, these things are happening and it's shocking, but also it's, me being a 6-year-old girl at the local Woolco and a guy comes and walks up beside me and he's, masturbating. And it's the, being grabbed while we're in line getting a drink at the bar when we're 19 years old. And it's, and everything that we know. And every single woman I know has stories like this. And most of us have more than one. And in fact, most of the women I know could sit and talk for an hour about the many, many stories and so much of it is normalized that, when Me Too happened, when at the beginning of Me Too, I started to look at the stories of my life as a lot of women did, as a lot of people did. And there were ones that I was like, oh, I kind of pushed that one to the recesses of my memory. And oh,
Mm.
I made this one not so bad in comparison to that one. And I made all of it not so bad in comparison to what my friend lived with. And so what I'm really, interested in and curious about is like, how do we let ourselves get close to this situation? Not
Mhm.
close to it like I'm going to read all the files and I want to be in the drama of it all. Like I'm not even reading that stuff. There's enough that's finding its way to me, and I get it. I got it. I know what's happening there. So I don't mean close to it in that, you know, watching the car crash. I mean close to it, like where is this actually living here in our community, inside of me, inside of my own relationship with myself? Like, where is domination still living in me? And domination, extraction as a form of domination, you know, all of the various expressions. So, yeah, that's where I'm really interested in going because locking up those bad guys, sure. But then, you know, am I going to lock up the parts of myself? I'm not saying that shouldn't happen. I think, yeah, we need some sort of justice there. Absolutely. And also, I can't lock up all the parts of me that want to dominate my children. Like, there's going to have to actually, at some level, be healing and integration. And what is the pathway forward? Because this
Mm,
and that the holy wail that I'm hearing from the women, from the mothers, from many people is this cannot stand. This cannot be our normal. You know, it's not good enough. It's not good enough for any of our children. So, yeah.
mm, mm. Yes, thank you. A lot of threads there. I'm going to see what I can do to stitch a few responses. One, yeah, you spoke of this idea of men in these sort of circumstances, consider themselves good men to see this kind of behavior and to distance themselves from it, to say, "Oh, you know, that's not me." That certainly characterized my earlier years, you know, like in teenagers and early 20s, where overall I grew up, as a lot of men do, who consider themselves more sensitive and, you know, wanting to be good. That
Mhm.
we would see this kind of behavior and destruction and be like, "Whoa!" Just in general, men are bad, right? There's that general sense, and so a lot of men grow up, as I did too, with a general, like I had friends, male friends, but it was generally like an untrustworthiness of men, right? Like men are inherently violent and destructive. And so there was this like leaning out. And I felt like I could better support women, you know, be an ally by aligning myself with the women in that kind of motion, like you did as well, like this pointing the finger and being like, yeah, that's terrible. That guy, he's terrible. Those guys, you know, they're awful. And something occurred to me largely through my journey into cultural work, into men's work, when I recognized that distancing of like, yeah, that bad guy over there is a sort of, it's a move that one denies the possibility or the presence of certain kinds of energies and patterns in myself. By doing that, you know, that's not me. I'm over here. I don't act that way at all, right? And the
Mhm.
other piece is that it kind of creates situations where men become more isolated into those very destructive patterns and wounding and pain without as much opportunity actually to be invited into the right spaces to work on it, to alchemize that.
Mm.
And so the different sort of visual that came to me was, you know, where it used to be like standing with the women and like, yeah, that guy. Then I started to realize, oh, actually, there's a different kind of possibility emerges if I, as a man, go stand to that other man next to the other man and say, hey, brother, we can do better,
Mm.
right? There's something else, like they're invited into something, you know? I'm not saying all, right? I mean, intense evil sociopaths, I mean, I'm not, maybe irredeemable, you know, then jail time is perhaps the only thing. But for a lot of men who are just caught in their pain and wounding and don't know how to deal with it, right, or lashing out and creating destruction, that invitation, I think, is a big part of what, I mean, to me, it's the spirit of what is men's work in
Yeah.
general. You know, that's the
Yeah.
call for like inviting men in to do the work together rather than offloading that, of course, on their families, on others, and society at large. So I just wanted to name that first. I'm curious, yeah, what stirs for you when you hear that?
Yeah, what stirs actually is a memory of when I was in high school. I actually had a lot of guy friends when I was in high school. Um, and there were two groups of guys in particular. And I remember one night I was hanging out with a couple of my guy friends at one of their houses, and we were like, you know, grade 11 or something. And we're drinking beers and hanging out and laughing and telling jokes. And it felt so natural. and they were my dudes. And I felt super safe with them. It was great. We had a great time. And then a couple days later, we were at school and I was in the school parking lot. And, I wouldn't say that me or those guys were like the super cool kids. And the super cool kids were like there. And somehow we all ended up together, like in the parking lot. And they were like, you were dancing on a pool table for these guys. And I was like, what? And they were standing right there. My friends were right there. And I said, what are you even talking? No, I wasn't. There, is there even a pool table at your house?
Mm,
Brian, do you even have a pool table? And my friends were just looking at their feet.
mm,
And I was standing there looking at them, kind of internally pleading with them to just look at me. You can make this right now. Because of course I didn't want to be seen as the girl that, went to hang out with boys and danced on tables for them. Like that wasn't how I was being. It just wasn't true. And I did not like, being wrapped up in some lie. But also like there's a whole bunch of stuff that goes with that as a girl, and now I'm, an enemy of the girls. It just puts me in a bad position to have that be my reputation. And also I had like a very strong sense of justice and like we need to make this right. This is not right. And I remember internally pleading with them, and in that moment I was like, "Oh, right, because there's a social code for you that you can't stick up for a girl over aligning with what these, bully dudes are saying about me."
mm,
And so I was heartbroken because I realized that we actually weren't really friends anymore. Like
mm,
I felt, and maybe, I was 15, 16. Like I didn't have the relational skills to be able to navigate that complexity with them. But my heart was broken and my trust was really broken. And, so the thing that you're naming, which is, it's not even like what I'm hearing is it's not I'm going to stand with the women against the men, but I'm just going to stand for what is right and true. And and if I can protect people from being hurt, why not?
mm,
And it takes a moral courage, but I can see for men that it may also in many ways take breaking a social code that
mm,
is has I'm sure been entrenched for a long time. And then the last thing I'll say is that on that post that I wrote, a friend of mine who's a gay man said that he understands homophobia at its root to be misogyny, because before people were calling him, gay slurs, they called him sissy and girly. And so there is this um, social code, as I understand it, that has boys from a young age have to separate themselves from girls and somehow put girls down or see them as I don't know, you can speak more to this because that wasn't my conditioning. Um, but I really see what it takes, which is maybe a willingness to get beat up. Like that's scary, because if you
mm,
break that social code, you become the target.
mm.
Um, or
Well,
you
this,
risk becoming the target.
yeah, yeah. Thanks for sharing that story. And I think what comes to me, yeah, when you speak of social code, I think it speaks to a kind of hierarchy, right? That patriarchal society is based on hierarchy of domination, essentially.
Hmm.
And if people haven't really understood or explored this or let that in, domination doesn't have to be overt, right? It can be covert domination. It can be economic domination, right? Do this or else, you lose your job or
Hmm.
status or whatever it is. And a lot of men's sort of coaches and things within, particularly, of course, in the manosphere realm, as it's named, have a lot of sort of ideas about status and hierarchy. And there's a term, beta, I believe, is for a man who, again, isn't an alpha. He isn't a leader. He isn't.
Uh-huh. Yeah,
So,
yeah, yeah.
you know what I mean? So there's a whole. It speaks to essentially this hierarchy, right? This hierarchy of control and domination. And just a quick aside, it was fascinating for me to watch an interview with a fellow named David Sutcliffe, who's he's a men's coach therapist who interviewed Andrew Tate. This is
Hmm.
about 2 years ago.
Mm.
And Andrew, they had some relationship where he felt trusted enough that he would allow himself to be therapized, essentially, Andrew Tate, to this therapist. And it was such a fascinating conversation because I'll just cut to like the final kind of 10 minutes or so for folks. It's on YouTube, you can see it. But the whole thing was him essentially sort of blusteringly demonstrating his mastery, his self mastery over his domain, his work life, his time in the ring. I believe he was a boxer or a MMA fighter or something. And so the whole thing was him basically just continually asserting, no
Yeah.
weakness, absolutely no weakness, none here, that kind of tone. Until finally, the therapist eventually asked him to basically like put that down for a second and like what was there behind that constant need to assert himself. And Andrew Tate in this scenario, he's kind of like an archetypal figure, right? As far as I would call it an adolescent wounded male projecting confidence
Hmm.
as a response to that wound. And so, even though he's a one man himself, human male, but he's also again archetypal figure. A lot of men who are trying to emulate that. And so the therapist is asking him to be
Including
present.
most of our world leaders, or
Well,
many of our world leaders. Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's that quality, right, of this alpha male, right? And so anyway, the therapist is inviting him to actually, what's present, what's now. He was literally just kind of like, "Hey, I'm here. Like, what's here right now?" And he was like fidgeting and actually couldn't really be present. And he admitted in the conversation that he's essentially a deeply anxious person that has struggles almost basically ever to just be in the present moment,
Hmm.
right? Like he's just constantly trying to assert out of fear. It seems to be like a border or undercurrent of fear. Needs to constantly try to control his environment, to control himself in the hierarchy. So I just want to bring that up because that to me was one of the most naked, like kind of yeah, unconscious expressions. He wasn't doing it on purpose, but he was outing,
Yeah.
I think, what is the undercurrent of patriarchal domination, right? Is a constant sense of uncertainty, fear. Where am I in the hierarchy? Control. And so I'm relating that to the story, I think, of your friends there. And here was a moment, perhaps, for them to kind of like push back on this guy, right, and be like, "No, that didn't happen." Like, what, But that was one way, and that was tough, when you're a teenager and all those other social hierarchies are present. But I think the other, what I was speaking to as well, was perhaps a level of, it's almost like a Jedi move where it's like seeing maybe the man acting out or like enacting harm or something, and being able to go to his side and say, "I don't think you actually want to be this way. I think you want to be better." Right? Like, I mean, not saying it in those words, but a lot of men's work, I
Mm.
think, is that it's like seeing the wounded part and the part that wants to dominate and control and actually say, "I get it, and we can be better. Like, we can do this together." And that's the spirit, I think, of inviting men into that work, which is so much of a part of what I've done, for 5, 6 years, largely because of that very thing. Like, I realized I was like, oh, I actually need to kind of plant myself in the work with men because there's in doing a lot of mixed gender work as well and culture work, and particularly my time in the Tamara community in Portugal, which I'm sure you know about, that there was this recognition to me of when I was in my very first men's circle, actually there at Tamara, about 10 years ago, it was an intergenerational circle. I realized only there and during that time that I was like, oh, there's a whole part of me that just turns off. Like the part of me that's just sort of like activated when there's women around, right? Like whether there's like attraction or aversion or projection or against feelings of status or all that stuff. When there was no women around, I was like, oh my god, I can just relax that part. It doesn't have to be active all the time. And so I realized I was like, oh, there's really important work actually to be done just with men. and I'm sure maybe it's been similar for you with women when you realize, yeah, when there's something like a protected space for women to have deeper conversations, to alchemize, their pain, their wounds, to speak things maybe that are impossible to say often in relationship with their partners or whatever it is, that something becomes possible. And so
Yeah.
I'm curious, yeah, one to maybe hear a little bit about that kind of what the value is of that kind of space in the work that you're doing with women in terms of working on this.
Hmm.
And then after, perhaps I'd love to speak about what I've come to understand about the sexual shadow of men through my own experience of it, as well as the work I do with men as well.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there are sisterhood wounds, so that exists. So the idea of some perfected safe space because magically we're in a room with women that all goes away, that, it's a fantasy.
Mm.
Um, and of course, it's not just sisterhood wounds, there's racism can exist inside of women's spaces. Homophobia can exist inside of women's spaces, both the more like overt and covert expressions of those things. Patriarchy and misogyny can exist inside of women's spaces. And there tends to be a greater capacity for exhale in the body, in the space, because I think the physical power over element isn't as present. Um, and um, I mean, I'm really generalizing because I think it massively depends on the quality of the space and how it's held and who is in the space and how we were invited into the space. So there's a lot of layers that actually go into like what can make a space where there actually can be deep exhale. And I imagine that in men's spaces as well. It's like you could just all get around and sort of sit around and pat yourselves on the back in front of each other and walk out and be like, okay, we all got to tell each other our resumes, but like, what is that actually? So in the spaces where there is a greater degree of exhale, I mean, there's a whole bunch of work that is happening on our part, but I think part of what is also happening in the background is there is a sense that there isn't a predator in the room. So the
Yes.
relaxation of hypervigilance. There is a sense that there is a less of a feeling of physical power over fear present in our bodies. And I find there's more space for emotional range to be expressed without being questioned or suppressed in some way. And
Mm.
so, my experience, and certainly now in the spaces that I hold, now I'm 46, and most of the women in my space are, in midlife or around the sort of broad midlife portal. So we've lived for a minute on this earth. And so there's also layers of that, like the comfort in our own experience and bodies and our own emotions and all the things that we've worked hard for in our lives. But um, what I find is like when women really express their rage, and a lot of rage will come out, a lot of grief will come out, the way that it's received in the space is usually a deep, deep understanding.
Mm.
And not a removed understanding, but like, yep, I feel that in my own way. I feel that. It's so interesting because, my partner and I had a conversation recently, and I was like filled with rage and pain, not towards him, but just towards this world and that harm is still so prevalent and so pervasive and so protected, actually. And I could feel him holding this posture that was so loving, which is like holding space for my rage or holding space for my pain. And I was like, why am I so agitated? Like, why do I feel so agitated at his attempt to hold space? Because it was sincere, it was coming from a loving place. He was like doing the opposite of wanting to shut me down. And I realized, and I said, like, I don't know, I don't exactly even know how to ask for this, but I'm realizing I want to feel what are you feeling? Like, what's happening over there with you? What does this elicit in you? both what we're talking about, what's happening, what does that elicit in you? But when you feel me like this, what does that elicit in you? What's happening over there? And and I realized like it's not that I want you to express your rage or your grief or your pain or your whatever in the same ways as me, but I want to feel it or I want to feel what is here. So
Hmm.
yeah, I get really curious about that because right now in this moment, we're talking and we're, on the other side of the release of at least some portion of the Epstein files. And the thing that I'm hearing so many women sort of rattle the cage. And of course, there are different flavors. I'm hearing some things that are a little bit more like, forget about the men. We're done with them. We don't need them. And I'm like, well, it doesn't really work that way. Actually, like we all still have to cohabitate together. We can't get rid of people. Um, I understand the impulse, but like that's not it from my lens. But I think when I hear like the sort of the thing underneath the thing, or sometimes the thing that's just being said, it's like we want you all the way here with us. And where are you in your feelings? What is this bringing in you? What's happening
Hmm.
there?
Hmm.
Yeah, so I don't know if I'm taking us on a tangent, but that's what's coming up as I'm
Yeah.
hearing you.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I really like how you articulated that, like a sense of like, because my partner as well, like when she's feeling things or expressing things, I think there's a desire, of course, of, I mean, on the one hand, a lot of men these days that are, if they're in the sacred sexuality and neo tantra and stuff, they'll maybe be able to hold that Shiva, unmoving presence, containment. And, it's funny, my voice automatically changes to sacred sexuality. And there's a value of that, obviously, I think, for women. This is, I think, a little bit maybe too much David Data, maybe
Mm,
mistranslation of David Data too. But the
mm,
sense
mm.
that the man has to be always just completely, holding the space and
Mountain. Yeah, yeah.
yeah, and again, that can be the right move when there's a lot of energy that's moving and emotionality and stuff. But then I hear you saying it's like after that, often the woman is like, okay, so like, how does that feel for you, right? Like, there's a feeling of wanting to be felt. Like my partner's like, I want to feel you, what you're feeling, as you're also feeling me and feeling, and that's actually kind of it's taken a while for for even me to be like, oh, that's the thing that is valuable, right? Versus
Yeah.
just kind of just holding space, for example. So
Mhm.
I think there's a really important aspects of what it feels to be met, right? And what you're saying with a woman, while things are going on as they are, or like big news like this is coming down and the
Mhm.
field's being stirred. It's like, yeah, I want to feel like where are the men at? Like I want to feel them.
Mhm.
And I think that was so much of the spirit of your Instagram post, which was like this open
Mhm.
letter to men, which is beautifully done. And I want to do one little pivot back to a piece that you said earlier because it was such a, I think, important thread around a lot of this stuff around the sexual shadow that is being revealed through the Epstein files and things, which is you said something like for women in women's spaces, they get to experience something around that. What you said was like existing without a predator in the room,
Mhm.
something like that. And I really appreciate the way you said that because I want a lot of men to hear that for a second, right? Because I'm trying to come up with a comparison because I don't think a lot of men understand what that would feel like, except perhaps I mean, maybe imagine you're going about your days, and every time you look over your shoulder, there's a wolf stalking you, right? Or I don't know, a bear or something, maybe, just, I mean, there was that whole big thing, right? A man or bear that came out, a couple
Mhm.
years ago or a
Yeah,
year or
yeah.
so ago. Would a woman rather be, trapped with a bear or man or something, right? And a lot of guys are like,
Yeah, yeah.
what?
If you're walking in the
They,
forest, you'd rather come
yeah,
across a man or a bear, right?
yeah. And a lot of women said bear. No, no question. It'd be bear. And a lot of men, what? How could, what? And they tried to argue it like logically. Like I saw, there's one post with some kind of guys that were, it was just sort of this kind of obnoxious panel, but they had these young women on and they're like, so you'd rather choose a bear? Like, and they were like, you guys are idiot. Like there was just, they were trying to like rationally understand their reaction. And they were like, no, bear. And, and they were missing what was actually being
Yeah.
said, which is most women don't feel safe with a man around. I think because of what exactly you're speaking to, which is this predatory energy,
Yeah.
which manifests often as entitlement to women, a sense
Mhm.
that they're there for you. for your pleasure or for your consumption, right?
Hmm.
The objectification, which is, if men don't really understand what that means, it's like basically, again, it's turning them into an object of your fantasy or your desire rather than somebody that is subjective and has their own agency and, may or may not be interested in you at all. But there's a certain turning them into something. And so that predatory energy, which I think you're speaking to now, basically women will face for their entirely to adult lives until they reach a point of some degree of age, let's say, where they no longer are appealing to just call it the patriarchal man,
Yeah,
right? And then they
ageism
become
has
an,
invisibilized us sufficiently that
yeah,
we are less of a target. And still, I will say, my mom is in her 70s and she had like a very uncomfortable exchange with a man recently, and she was pretty caught off guard because been having the experience of feeling pretty invisible. Like she's standing at the deli counter
uh-huh,
and somebody walks up and just orders in front of, she's like, what? I'm like, it's literally right here. And she's not getting the looks, and she's not, that those things have pretty much slowed down or halted for her. And yet she still had the experience of feeling targeted in a different way. It was
mm,
a
mm,
different sort of targeting that was more about what can I get from this old lady, this fragile old lady. So,
uh-huh,
which is a
yeah, yeah,
different kind of
okay.
predatory nature. Hmm.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. No, thanks for that. So I think I wanted to illuminate that a little bit for men to have an understanding of what it is for women to feel essentially like the presence always when they're out and around of a kind of predatory energy that is not just inevitable. I would say it's not like an accident. That's just the way it is. That is actually a consequence of something. And the consequence of I've been able to track and explore through a number of years now with the Mythic Masculine podcast and various guests, and using a mytho-poetic understanding is that one way to kind of unpack it briefly. Maya Luna, who's a poet, you might know her from
Yeah.
her writings and all that. Yeah, but we had an interview a while ago, and it was something like attuning to the deep feminine current is what we were exploring. But she characterized patriarchy as the collective loss of the feminine is, I believe, how she spoke about it. And to me, that's the kind of, from a mythic understanding of patriarchy, as you could almost call it, through the loss of relationship, true relationship and reciprocity to the feminine, it becomes something to subjugate, to control, to consume. And that's how it kind of filters down from the collective to the personal, and how men are programmed, from a young age again to relate to the feminine, both to disassociate from it within their own beings. For again, young
Yeah.
boys, right? Again, don't be sissy, don't be a girl, all that stuff, and start to disassociate from anything understood to be feminine, the emotional landscape, and basically begin to adjust themselves for the dominance hierarchy. And then from that loss, from that disassociation, that loss, right? Jung might say from the loss of the anima within a man, then it becomes what another author spoke to, this idea of men then become fascinated and fearful of the feminine, right? There's this fascination and fearfulness, which then starts to manifest itself as, again, like either pedestalizing women and overly kind of projecting, like a lot of beta males would do this, right? According to the dominance hierarchy, like don't pedestalize the women, because the opposite is then to subjugate them, right? And to oppress, to control, because they're there for your taking and your consumption. And that thread, again, runs right up through the Epstein files and all of these powerful men who I would say, achieved a certain status within the dominance hierarchy, but were deeply soul wounded around their relationship to the feminine and to the ability to access what, Maya Luna might call the feminine current, and what I sometimes speak to like the feminine well, no longer able to access it or not access it within. And so inevitably, it creates this hungry ghost energy that wants to consume it throughout. And, Harvey Weinstein and, all these men, these powerful men, it becomes that energy. I call it actually the King Haggard effect from The Last
Hmm.
Unicorn,
Yeah.
the film, which, we don't have to get into, but that's how it's crystallized for me. So hearing all this too, I'd love to just hear what's stirring for you.
Hmm. Yeah, there's that loss of the feminine that you're naming. I think that it's through the slowing down and noticing for all of us. I'm not just saying for men, for all of us, noticing where we try to get rid of that or where we can't find it. Like there's a kind of black hole in our being that there's a missing, a something missing. And I think tracking and staying close to that feeling, not mentally, but like, what is in there? What is, if I enter the black hole of the something that is missing, what is there? And there's an intense vulnerability. When I say to my partner, I want, I'm seeing him breathing and holding space, and I'm like, can you get on the ground with me? Like, where is your whale? I think that what I'm craving is can we together feel the utter devastating vulnerability that we don't actually know what to do, that this is so hard, that this is confusing and backwards. Like, I think there's a deep reckoning that we're being invited into. And I would, man, like if we could, like a tidal wave, surrender into the intense vulnerability. And maybe this is the lost feminine, but the intense vulnerability of we don't know how to change it, but it has to change. And just feel the tender rawness at the bottom of that truth. That is the change. That is literally the seed of the change. Is the tender is to feel our weakness, is to be in touch with our weakness. And I think a lot about how if we pay attention to what marginalized folks are saying or historically marginalized folks are saying, we can learn a lot about the way forward. I'm like listening to queer people, listening to Black women, paying attention to Indigenous folks and the wisdom that's being shared from them. But I think that just like you're saying, there's a way of pedestalization, which is sort of like, they'll save us. Like we're not going to kind of go all the way into the tender, mushy vulnerability, terrifying vulnerability that we don't know what to do. We're going to like look at it out of the corner of our eye and then be like, who can save us? Who's going to do this? It's sort of like even I hear that in the like lock them up. Get all these predators, lock them up. And I'm like, that's not going to save us though. Like, sure. Yes, we need justice, but there's more. And I've seen a lot of AI videos floating around, because we're also in the Minnesota moment right now. I've seen a lot of AI videos floating around, and they're, if you can note it, pay attention, you can really see that they're AI for a lot of different reasons. But I've seen so many where it is a Black teacher or a Black pastor or a Black, person with a AK-47, and they're like warding off the ICE officers who, in the face of their righteous rage, cower and leave. And I'm like, this is part of the fantasy that there is, you know, we can just, who's going to save us? And so I hear, as you're speaking, I'm hearing that, a lot of the sort of really good men are like, okay, women, your turn. You can do this. We're clearly messing this up. And I'm like, yeah, kind of. But actually, where we really need to go is all the way into the tenderness together. We need to feel the ground of our grief and our hopelessness, and also like the tender longing that lives there. I think grief and longing are siblings. They're two sides of the coin. And in the bottom of the grief, there's a longing, and that longing is a powerful seed for everything that we create. And so I think the way or a way that we can meet this moment is if we're looking at, listening to the voices of marginalized people and, hearing the prophecies, of the, indigenous folks of the world. And like, there's a sort of like hearing the call of the women, it's like, can we allow that to change us instead of thinking those are the people that are going to save us? Can we be changed by it? So I'm sort of like, I think what if we were in the project of queering ourselves in this moment, like coming into a deeper, more expansive nature of self, actually, is part of the assignment. Yeah.
What comes to me, thank you. What comes to me is a sense of what does it mean to be, yeah, to engage with the times. And I think that for any men's work and women's work, I'd say, but any men's work that doesn't turn men back towards our communities, towards our relationships, towards culture regeneration, ultimately is already been colonized, commodified, and it just
Mhm.
becomes about self transformation, navel gazing. And I understand the appeal, but at the same time, again, it has to turn us back towards the world. I think, and
Yeah.
as men to participate meaningfully, and in yeah, at certain moments that means to raise your voice alongside the women and the queer folk and the indigenous folk who are saying like, yeah, this has been like this for a long time, and to yeah, to uphold those voices, to amplify those voices, to
Mhm.
share where we stand within these things. And also sometimes it means to step back, I think, for men to
Mhm.
allow others to come to the front. And sometimes it means to stand in the front to protect the others that are
Mhm.
typically doing a lot of frontline engagement work, to give them a break, actually. So, for example, so there's lots of ways I think to be engaging with the times and be in this place of introspection. And I feel like having other models of possibility are obviously so important.
Mhm.
For many years I was involved in documentary filmmaking, and really I began to see the value of visionary media, visionary storytelling that basically projected forward possibility that could become an attractor for culture working folks and others, to participate meaningfully towards. Because if you don't have other models, I think this is Buckminster Fuller, it's like you need that energy to flow somewhere, right? Rather than
Yeah.
just against or holding patterns. And so I
Right.
feel like,
Yes.
yeah, yeah, and I feel like the emerging mimetic, imaginary possibility is that I see largely being spoken by women such as yourself is matriarchal
Yeah.
understanding, or return to make a return or a new emergence of matriarchy. And I think my conversations, I think with it was Riane Eisler and others, have I believe it may still be the case that there's actually not been a a matriarchy, a society that was matriarchal, that was a mirror image of patriarchal domination structures. Like, and I think this is the fear that a lot of, say men carry. They're like, oh, does that mean women are in charge and control everything and dominate?
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's a
Yeah.
misunderstanding. Yeah, that's like
Mhm.
patriarchal understanding of, oh, it must just be the opposite of patriarchy, but it's not, clearly.
Mhm.
And I'd love to invite you to speak a little bit more of your understanding.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so tricky, right? We have these terms like masculine and feminine, and then and then we get very gendered about them. And we sort of flatten our understanding of the richness that is there. The way that I like thinking about patriarchy as a structure and matriarchy as a structure is through the shape of them. And so if we think of patriarchy as a triangle, there's you and me and everyone else that, we're maybe somewhere in the middle, but there's, then the global south and more marginalized folks at the bottom. And then you've got like, you know, the billionaires come trillionaires at the top, essentially. We know that that shape is not working for us. That is the shape that we have been moving in. Um, I like to think of it almost like, if you contorted your body into a certain way and then just stayed with that contortion, like eventually the whole body starts to break down and you're like, okay, we need to get out of this shape. This shape is not working. So I think that sometimes where I see a defensiveness over the system, and that defensiveness can be overt, like a fighting, it can be like very overtly misogynistic, but it can also be a fear of changing the system. Just a subtle fear of like, oh no, we have to titrate this, or oh no, but this is what we know, is a fear that we're just going to try to put different people in charge. And then people have all sorts of feelings about that. And what matriarchy is actually a circle. I think of it, the shape of matriarchy as being a circle. And what we do with the circle is we put the most vulnerable people in the middle of the circle. Children will always be there. People who have just given birth will always be there. And the rest of us are going to have probably a time or times in our life where we end up in the middle. You get sick, you go through a crisis, you are injured, you end up somewhere closer to the center. But you just take care of the ones who need most taking care of. And then everyone else has their role/roles inside of community. And those roles can also shift and change because your role as a man, in a 17-year-old body is different than your role as a man in a 77-year-old body. That's just, that's logical. It is logical that our roles would shapeshift and change, and that sometimes we end up being amongst the vulnerable, and sometimes we are amongst the providers and protectors. And it means that we don't have to inherently have these fixed gendered roles where man equals protector, and woman equals nurturer, that we have some malleability about the roles that we move in, and perhaps more space to be in our naturalness and to be exploring what are at the edges of our being, and how does each one's skills and talents and proclivities and you know um, ancestral inheritances fit into this moving dynamic circle of life. And so that's how I like to think about it. I like to think of it as a deeply rational, totally sensible change of shape, because the triangle is not working really for anybody, arguably not even for the guys at the top. Because what kind of soul loss do you have to experience in order to be indoctrinated into hoarding so much wealth and being part of a system that is so entrenched in massive destruction of the earth and humanity that the only possible solution is to go colonize another planet that has no food for us, no trees for us, no beauty, no air, nothing, literally nothing. I mean, we're at the moment of like peak insanity. If we're defining insanity as like the delusion that this can be, that this is working when it's really, truly, honestly not. So to me, I think when people get frozen in how do we do it, I think how can we move into circle in our own lives, in our own households, in our communities, in our relationships. It's like I think a lot, I'm a mom, and I think, why do we not attend to crying babies? Why did the norm become put the baby in another room and shut the door? When that has never existed in human history. Never in human history did we put the baby in another room and shut the door. The crying baby goes onto the body of a safe person. That's what happens with the crying baby. And then you figure out, what does the baby need? Maybe that's all they needed was to be on the body. Maybe they need food. Maybe they're cold. Maybe they need to be cleaned. There's so many things that can be happening. But if we cannot touch our own tenderness, if we can't handle the parts inside of us that are crying, we cannot handle the sound of that tender, vulnerable, crying one, and we have to put them away, which is the opposite of centering the vulnerable. It's the opposite of putting them at the center. So the shape for me helps me in my daily life consider just moment to moment, even if I want to get out of this triangle shape that also lives inside of me and my psyche. For sure. That lives inside of me and my psyche. Where am I prioritizing work? Where am I saying, put up and shut up to my body? Where am I wanting my kids to just stop? It's all understandable. Like, but where am and how can I do this again and again and again and again and again and again? And then what needs to change? Like, how can we architect more change? Because it does necessitate change, as like a mom, in order to be able to center the most vulnerable, I need more help. So what does support then look like? And how do we architect more community around us? And yeah, it asks us to, I think we have a lot of focus on what needs to happen on a governmental level and bigger structural levels. And it's all important work. But also, the structures are designed to self sustain. And they're designed to self sustain until the logical conclusion, which is collapse. That's the logical conclusion, which is why they're planning out the colonization of Mars, which is bananas when it's all right here, you know? Um, so I think overly relying on the system to change rather than there are some people who are invested in that good work, bless them, but like, how do we change the systems in our own homes, in our own psyches? How do we build community together? I think building community together is like the biggest assignment of our times. And building not just more triangle structures, but starting to build more circular structures. And so, yeah, this we are using the word matriarchal in part not because women should be the boss of everything, although there is a little bit of a um, we are one of very few species, humans, that has menopause, where menopause exists. And in all of the other species where there is a menopause, the function of the postmenopausal female is to be a leader in the community. But it's not because there's some like superior. I mean, if we think that what that means is, oh, well, then we have to acknowledge that women are superior to men. No, no, no. That is this triangle framework where you say, oh, well, then we put women on top. Well, then that means something that then we have to just accept the women are the superior. And that is not an argument that I'm interested in being in or trying to make. I think what it's saying is that the postmenopausal female or the, woman who's been around for a minute has the wider view just in terms of the biology, her hormones, having experienced motherhood and caregiving so intimately to be able to say, okay, I can see what is needed here so that we center the most vulnerable better. And and then that centering of the most vulnerable ripples out to how we do life together, how we secure the perimeter together and be safe together, how we move together, how we live together, how we love together. Um, so yeah, I think what I want for people who kind of bristle at the idea of matriarchy to consider is it's just saying we're centering the vulnerable and that there are some people who have their attention on that more. I don't really care what gender they are, but there are some people, and we should pay attention to who's tracking in a good way how we can center the vulnerable and just hear them take notes, pay attention, see how we can, like, okay, let that change us and let that move us and let that orient us in good ways.
There was a meme floating around maybe earlier this year. It was something around uh, basically, wouldn't it be great if Trump, before he made any decision, would have to answer to a council of grandmothers? And wouldn't it be a form of in deep sanity if any leader, man or woman, any leader of position of power like that had to answer to a council of grandmothers, which
Mhm.
I understand through some of my indigenous guests I've had on my show has been the case in matrilineal cultural frameworks where exactly
Mhm.
that. The chief wasn't doing a good job, then the grandmothers say, okay, you're relinquished from their post for one that can understand actually exactly what you're speaking to, how to keep the vulnerable at the center, how to be in service to life itself. So may
Mhm.
we continually move towards sanity. May this call, this outrage around how it's been provoked through these files and through this shadow, may it be interrupted and alchemized
Mhm.
into a more sane and beautiful way of being.
Mhm.
Nisha, such a pleasure
Mhm.
to speak with you. I wonder,
Such
I
a
know this is going to be posted on both of our channels. So I wonder for my listeners, how might they find you and the work that you're doing?
Everything I do is under my name, which is makes it easy. So my name is Nisha Moodley. That's how to find me on Instagram. That's my website.com. Yeah, those are my main two channels. How about you?
Well, folks can find me at themythicmasculine.com, where, of course, I have conversations like this, but also upcoming in-person gatherings for men, as well as an online 3-month program called The Deep Masculine, where we go deep into a lot of this territory through myth, through somatics, through ritual. And then finally, on the horizon, which is also one reason that we're speaking here, you caught wind of something that I was starting to put together,
Mm.
will be the Cascadia Men's Conference, which is actually going to be a larger gathering, probably close to 100 men or so we're aiming at, which will happen for the first year, this year, outside of Vancouver, close to Squamish, which will gather men together to do this work of
Mm.
cultural healing, regeneration, inquiry, and alchemy, I think that is so needed in these times.
Mhm.
So folks can check that out as well, cascadiamensconference.com. And yeah, tune into, both of our work if this is of interest to them.
Grateful to be linked arm in arm with you, brother, as you do this important work and as we do this collective work. And I think the last thing that I want to say is the possibility of what can be, not just could be, but what can be, not in a fantasy if only it had been different, but it can literally happen right now. And we can all be part of it, is
Mm,
something so much more beautiful than any of us have seen in our lifetimes. What would it be if we could stay here on this beautiful earth and we could experience togetherness and kinship and love and freedom, like actual real freedom, not like the freedom to own a gun and shoot anybody who comes near you, but like the freedom to have a soft belly when you're walking around, the freedom to make mistakes and learn and be loved. And, I want us to stay like keep knitting ourselves to the vision for something
mhm,
so much more beautiful that makes the world better for our kids, all of our kids, not just the kids in our own houses, but
mhm,
all of the kids, because that's actually what's better for the kids in our own houses, is that the world is better for all of them.
mhm,
And that is something that I think all people who have any connection with our hearts can get on board with. Like, we should make it better for them. And it isn't totally mystifying if we pay attention to just what happens when we put vulnerable beings at the center and then let that reorganize our ways of being and moving and living together.
mhm.
Yeah.
A beautiful prayer. Maybe so.
Thank you.
Till next time.
Till next time.